Since I was little, my life has been a series of temporary goodbyes. My mother, a dedicated executive, often travelled for work, leaving me in the care of my stepfather. Marcos was a tall man with slightly greying brown hair and always had a warm smile and a kind word. Marcos came into our lives when I was still very young, and over time he became more than a stepfather. He was my confidant, my protector, almost a second father. The days of my mother's departure were always the same. He would hug me tightly with his wheeled suitcase at his side, promising to bring a gift from his travels with her wheeled suitcase by her side, promising to bring a gift from her travels. "Take care of yourself, honey, and take care of Marcos too," she would say to me with a smile before walking out the door. Then the house, normally filled with her laughter and energy, would become quietly big and empty, except for Marcos's presence in those moments. Marcos would make sure I didn't miss her too much. He would prepare our meals and always made an effort to cook my favourite dish, spaghetti bolognese. Although his specialty was more the barbecue than the cooking, he would try to cook my favourite dish. He would try to make the sauce like my mother, and we would both laugh at the differences, and he always insisted that someday he would beat her recipe in the evenings. After dinner, he would sit next to me on the big sofa in the living room, covering us with a blanket, while we watched classic movies or TV shows that talked about travelling and adventures around the world. He would tell stories of his youth, his travels and his dreams, making the world seem so small and accessible, even though we were only in the living room. As I grew older, these moments of companionship became more meaningful to me. Mark was the adult who was always there, always attentive to my needs and feelings, aware of the subtle changes in my moods, knowing when I needed to talk about school, friends, or the confusions of growing up. Even though my mother travelled constantly, I never felt truly alone. Mark filled the spaces she left, not only with affection, but with a presence as comforting as it was necessary. No matter how much my mother was a figurehead for my family, as much as my mother was the authority figure, it was Marcos who wove normalcy and affection into the daily life of our home. At the time, I didn't fully understand the depth of that connection, nor how it would begin to change as we entered adolescence, becoming something neither of us expected or knew how to handle. That autumn afternoon when my mother left for an important conference, the silence in the house was palpable. Marcos, my stepfather, announced in the morning that he was going to prepare something special for dinner, something just for the two of us, which immediately added a breath of anticipation to the day. He carefully chose the ingredients, opting for dishes he knew I loved, but with a more sophisticated and gourmet touch than our usual meals. The preparation started early as Marcos cooked the house filled with enveloping aromas, albacore garlic and tomatoes, slowly cooked in a spaghetti sauce, along with thin slices of parmesan and shavings of black truffle, which he said he had saved for a special occasion. The background music, soft jazz classics, complemented the ambience, transforming our kitchen into something more like an intimate bistro. When dinner was ready, the table was set with simple elegance candles, fine china that we rarely used, and a small vase with a single flower. Marcos wore an elegant apron and a smile that lit up the room. He served me as if I were the maître of a fine dining restaurant, describing each dish with a detail that showed how much he had put into that meal as the evening progressed. As the evening progressed, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. What started as a cordial dinner was gradually becoming a more emotional and meaningful experience. The glances we exchanged from time to time were longer and longer, full of an intensity trying, without managing to ignore it completely, with every smile, every accidental touch. As we passed the plates, or filled the wine glasses, the tension between us grew, mixing admiration with a glimpse of something more risky. We finished eating and cleaned the kitchen together, a ritual that we had always tried to do together, a ritual that had always been a part of us. Together, the kitchen, a ritual we had always had. But that night it seemed different. There was a lightness between us, punctuated by laughter and exchanges of glances that made my heart beat faster. The physical closeness, once casual and familiar, was now tinged with a new context, more charged and aware of every move. After washing up, we sat down on the couch to watch a movie, but it was hard to concentrate on the screen. Thoughts of what was happening, about what might happen, swirled in my mind. It was a mixture of curiosity, fear, and excitement, feelings that I knew I had to evaluate carefully. But that night, I found irresistibly attractive that night, left an indelible mark on me, a turning point in our relationship that I knew I would have to explore and understand. As I fell asleep, the emotions of the night swirled in my mind, a whirlwind of feelings that I knew I would have to face sooner or later. It was an unknown and complicated terrain. But a part of me was curious to know where I would have to face. Sooner or later it was an unknown and complicated terrain. But a part of me was curious to know where I would have to face. Sooner or later it was an unknown and complicated terrain. But a part of me was curious to know where I would have to face sooner or later. I was curious as to where it might lead me. As the months passed after that special dinner, I noticed a gradual and profound change in our domestic dynamic. Mark, who was once simply my stepfather, my mother's husband, began to occupy a more significant space in my life. He became someone I trusted deeply, someone with whom I could share not only the trivialities of everyday life, but also my innermost thoughts and questions. He always had time for me, no matter how busy he was. If he came home from school with this constant availability created a bond between us that went beyond what you expect from a stepfather-stepdaughter relationship. Our conversations at first about superficial matters began to deepen. We would talk about books, philosophy movies, and even moral dilemmas. Mark had a way of thinking that I admired. He was able to see the nuances of every situation he taught me, to look at problems from different angles, encouraging me to form my own opinions, rather than passively accepting the ideas of others. He taught me to see problems from different angles, encouraging me to form my own opinions as he opened up about his own life, his hopes and frustrations. I also felt more comfortable revealing my fears and aspirations. It was as if he not only understood, but also shared many of the emotions I was experiencing. This reciprocity created moments of real emotional connection between us. These exchanges became more and more frequent and intense, and I began to notice a change in the atmosphere. When we were together, there was a warmth, an electricity in the air that seemed to charge every chance encounter in the kitchen or every late-night conversation in the living room. Every smile, every glance began to have an add that neither he nor I commented on, but that we both felt deeply. This new closeness brought with it a mixture of comfort and confusion. It was comforting to have someone to share so much of myself with, but at the same time, this intensity began to frighten me. I found myself thinking of him at random times of the day, looking forward to our encounters, something that went beyond the boundaries of the conventional and the safe. This phase of our relationship culminated in one particularly revealing night. We were sitting on the balcony, we were sitting on the floor in a room with a friend, and we were sitting on the balcony with a friend, and we were sitting on the floor with a friend, and we were sitting on the balcony with a friend. Revealing we were sitting on the balcony, looking at the stars. After a dinner we had taken together, the conversation turned to our dreams in life, what we wanted to achieve, and how we saw ourselves in the future. It was. Then, in a moment of silence, filled with an unspoken understanding, we both acknowledged without words that what we felt for each other had evolved in a way neither of us had anticipated nor knew how to handle. We continued to talk about everything. But now there was a layer of complexity and urgency that neither of us knew. How to resolve it was an emotionally charged terrain that defied the rules and forced us to reflect deeply on the paths we should choose. It was a Thursday night, one of those days when the weight of the world seems to fall on your shoulders without warning. Everything was especially difficult for me, and in the absence of my mother, who was away on business, I felt more isolated than ever. Mark was at home, as always, my constant support as he noticed how down I was as soon as I walked in the door. He put aside what he was doing to devote himself to me. He invited me to sit on the living room sofa, away from the books and responsibilities that awaited me in the bedroom, with a kindness that had become his trademark. He brought me a cup of hot tea and sat next to me with a posture that indicated he was there to listen. I vented about the difficulties at school, the friends who seemed increasingly distant, and the pressure to maintain good grades. Mark listened to me with a patience rarely found in other people, without interrupting me, without judging me, just nodding or giving me a sympathetic look when I finished. He did not immediately start. This simple but profound gesture broke the last barrier. I was trying to keep feeling vulnerable. The tears began to flow freely, and he gently pulled me into his embrace. It was a long and tight hug, of those that seemed to try to put back together all the broken pieces of someone we stayed like that for a while, sharing the silence and comfort of closeness. It was a form of comfort that went beyond the normal boundaries. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was incredibly intimate. It was as if in that moment he understood exactly what I needed, without me having to explain it to him. His presence, the firmness of his embrace, conveyed a security and care that I rarely felt. He moved into a territory of emotional connection that neither of us expected or fully understood. In that moment, it was a night that stayed with us, complicating and enriching the feelings that continued to develop between us in a complex web of affection and confusion. That morning, after a night of intense and restless reflection, I felt that we could no longer pretend that everything was normal. The events of the last few weeks, especially the night before, when Marcos comforted me in a way that went beyond the usual limits, made it clear that something had changed between us. The silence that followed that night was dense, loaded with everything we had not said. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. No matter how uncomfortable it was, I knew it was essential to face it. I found Marcos in the kitchen preparing breakfast, a routine that had become our usual moment of calm before starting the day. But that day, the atmosphere seemed anything but quiet. As soon as he saw me, I perceived a hesitation in his gaze, as if he also knew that this confrontation was inevitable. With a trembling but firm voice, I started Marcos. "We have to talk about what is going on between us." He stopped still with his back to me, and after a long sigh, he gave me a long sigh. He said to me, "We have to talk about what is going on between us." A long sigh, he turned around. The look he gave me was a mixture of fear and sadness. He knew as I did that we had crossed a threshold we shouldn't have. However, the sincerity in his eyes when he began to speak disarmed me. "I know he said it, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't have his words." They had a weight that I had never seen in him before. He interrupted me, and I was sorry I shouldn't have his words, had a weight that I had never seen in him before. And then he confessed in careful words, full of doubt. He admitted to feeling more than he should, more than was appropriate for a stepfather. "I care about you more than I should in a way that I can't and shouldn't feel anymore." He revealed with his voice low and full of conflict this confession. Although expected, it was like a shock to know that these feelings were mutual. It only intensified the confusion and emotional chaos I already felt. Now we were both aware that we shared something that went beyond the established limits, established something that we could not simply ignore or forget. The air in the kitchen became even heavier after his confession. There was an unspoken decision that we had to resolve this, but how the complexity of our feelings made any choice painful and complicated at that moment. Looking at the man who had been a father figure, but now revealed himself in such a different way, I felt a mixture of fear, sadness, and undeniably a sense of closeness that we could no longer deny. We decided it would be best to keep our distance at least until we could understand and control our feelings. Mark agreed to go to a psychologist to help him manage his emotions, and I promised him I would do the same as he walked away. Something inside me knew that whatever happened, our relationship had changed forever after the confession that changed everything between us. Mark and I found ourselves on uncertain and forbidden ground. The decision to keep our distance did not last long. The gravity of our feelings seemed to push us back towards each other, despite our initial intentions. We knew it was wrong. We were walking a thin line of morality and loyalty. But the truth was that we were consumed by something that seemed bigger than us. My mother continued with her business trips, and those absences that were once something normal in our lives now became secret opportunities for Marcos and I to see each other in the cloak of normalcy. But each encounter was charged with emotion and urgency. Marcos began to carefully plan those moments. He proposed to organise movie sessions at home on Friday nights when my mother was away. He said it was to keep up the family tradition. But we both knew it was more than that. During those movies, our hands would meet in the popcorn bucket, our shoulders would subtly touch, and each shared laugh was a reminder of what I hid. Other days he would come up with homework projects that supposedly required 2 pairs of hands. We would spend our evenings working side by side, exchanging glances and words that only we understood. These projects were never urgent, unnecessary, but were excuses to be together to explore the connection. That despite our efforts, we couldn't deny all this secrecy added a layer of excitement, but also guilt. I knew we were cheating on my mother, the woman who trusted both of us. Every smile Mark and I exchanged in her presence when she returned from her travels was tinged with remorse. I watched her face happy and relieved to be home, not knowing that her home was not the sanctuary of honesty she believed. Our situation became increasingly complex. While one part of me reveled in the moments Mark and I shared, another shrank under the weight of our betrayal. It was like living 2 lives, one in the light of day, full and open, the other in secret, dark and full of forbidden desires. Every secret encounter, every whispered conversation, every discreet touch, every whispered conversation, every discreet touch, every discreet touch, every whispered conversation, every discreet touch, every discreet touch, every whispered conversation, every whispered conversation, every whispered touch, every whispered touch, every whispered touch, every whispered touch, whispered. Conversation, every discreet touch, were pieces of a puzzle we were putting together, without knowing very well what the final picture would be. But one thing was certain: we could not go on like this forever. The truth, however painful it was, would have to come to light, and I feared the day when all that we had built in the shadows would have to face the day when everything we had built in the shadows would have to come to light. And I feared the day when everything we had built in the shadows would have to come to light. As the days went by, every moment I shared with Mark seemed to be painted with both bright colours of joy and dark shades of guilt. The excitement of our secret encounters was often overshadowed by the weight of the secret we were keeping. I felt increasingly divided, as if I lived in 2 different worlds, one in which I was the loyal and devoted daughter, and another in which I became a version of myself that I barely recognized, entangled in a web of desire and duplicity every time my mother called me to tell me she was coming home. The next day, my stomach knotted up. Welcoming her with hugs and smiles became an exercise in interpretation. I wondered, as we watched a movie together or shared a meal, if she would notice any change in my look, or the way I avoided talking too much about how my days had been. Then there was Mark, who increasingly seemed to carry a similar burden. He began to show signs of where dark circles marked his face and was quieter during our meetings. Conversations that had once flowed freely were now punctuated with long silences, during which I could see the worry in his eyes. One night, he confessed to me, in a deep and trembling voice, that he too was struggling with the weight of our situation, beginning to consume me, he admitted, and his words echoed my own feelings. This joint confession of our inner struggles brought a new reality to our relationship. What had begun as a series of furtive and passion-filled moments made me feel as if I was betraying her not only as a wife, but also as a mother. My mother, and the growing awareness of how deep the betrayal was, began to haunt me. I knew that no matter how strong the feelings were between Marcos and I, we could no longer ignore the impact of our actions. The doubt between following my heart or protecting my mother became a constant internal battle. It was during a rainy afternoon, while my mother was on another business trip, when I sat down with Marcos to talk about our future. The raindrops were hitting the window, reflecting the turmoil in our hearts. With looks of understanding, we agreed that something had to change. It was not just about what we felt for each other, but about the respect and love we owed to the woman who brought us together, even in such a complicated way. Deciding what to do next was the hardest part. We knew that sooner or later, we would have to face the consequences of our actions, choosing a path that we hoped would lead to some kind of redemption, or at least a resolution that could bring peace to all those involved. Truth has a way of coming to light, often in ways we never expected. And so it was that our situation, carefully hidden under layers of secrets and silences, began to crumble. The revelation came through our neighbour, Mrs. Martins, an attentive and perceptive woman who always had an eye for details that others might overlook. Mrs. Martins had always been friends with my mother, with whom she shared occasional breakfasts and conversations about the neighbourhood. she began to notice a certain frequency of projects that Mark and I were doing together. Our laughter a little too loud to be just family complicity. Our family complicity, our love of each other, too loud to be just family complicity. Our glances a bit prolonged with no intention of causing harm, but moved by genuine concern. She mentioned her observations to my mother in casual conversation, suggesting that perhaps something deeper was going on than mere leisure activities. My mother, back from her last business trip, was armed with this suspicion sown by her neighbour. She did not confront, she immediately preferred to observe for herself before jumping to conclusions. But the tension at home was palpable. She was quieter, more observant. Her gaze was often fixed on me and on Marcos, with a new inquisitive intensity. Finally, one Wednesday evening, she decided to confront the situation. It was after dinner, and we were sitting in the living room with a forgotten television program on in the background. He turned off the TV abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. "We need to talk," he started with a firm voice, but I could notice a slight tremor denoting his anxiety. He told us about the conversation with Mrs. Martins, how she had started to notice small changes in herself afterwards. "I need to know what is going on here," he said, staring at us with a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. Mark and I exchanged a quick glance, a silent agreement that it was time to reveal everything. With a loud sigh, it was Mark who started to reveal everything. Heavy sigh. It was Mark who began to speak carefully, choosing his words, trying to minimize the pain they would cause us. He confessed what we felt for each other, explaining that it had all started innocently, but had turned into something neither of us had foreseen or consciously desired. I continued after him with my own words, stumbling over my confusion and guilt. I explained how torn and tormented I felt, how we were fighting our feelings but could not. My mother's reaction was a complex mix of emotions. She was visibly shocked. Nothing the words seemed to cut her like razors. But in the midst of the pain, there was also a surprising strength. She did not scream or cry, but spoke of the need to process this situation before deciding how to respond. "We are going to need some time to process this," she said, "and we are going to need help to get through it." That night, the house seemed colder, darker, as if a shadow had settled over us. We all retreated into separate spaces, wrapped up in our own thoughts and regrets, reflecting on the fragments of a family life that would have to be rebuilt somehow. In the days to come, the room was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the muffled sound of each of us breathing. My mother sat on the couch, with her eyes fixed on us, searching for answers she knew would be difficult to give. It was as if the weight of all our unspoken words hung in the air, like a dark and oppressive cloud. Finally, it was Mark who broke the silence. His words sounded like a confession torn from his chest. He explained with raw honesty and admirable bravery how our feelings had evolved in a way we had never expected. Each word was like a sharp blade cutting through the mask of normalcy we had tried to maintain until that moment. And then it was my turn. I was forced to admit the depth of my own guilt, the way I had let myself be consumed by feelings I knew were forbidden and wrong. Each confession was like a punch in the gut, but also the release of a burden I had carried in silence for so long. My mother listened to it all in silence, with a complex expression mixed with pain and understanding. She did not cry out, but seemed to freeze as if processing the magnitude of what she had just learned. And then slowly she began to speak, with words charged with a sincerity and intensity I had never seen before. She spoke of the disappointment and sadness she felt upon discovering the betrayal within her own home, but also of the love and forgiveness she continued to feel for us. Despite it all, her words were like a light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there was still hope and redemption. That night was a whirlwind of emotions, a tornado of pain and regret, but also of love and forgiveness. As we retreated to our corners of the house, each of us carried the weight of that conversation in our hearts. We knew things would never go back to the way they were, but we also knew we had taken the first step towards healing and reconciliation. And that, in a way, was a glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm that loomed over us. After that night of revelations, our family was thrown into a whirlwind of emotions my mother faced, with the harsh reality of betrayal within her own home, made the difficult decision to separate. It was a moment of heartbreak and facing the unknown, but it was also the first step towards healing and rebirth for me. It was a moment of deep reflection and self-discovery. I had to face the reality of my decisions and the impact they had had on my loved ones. The pain of separation from my parents was like an open wound, but it was also an opportunity to learn and grow. I vowed to myself that I would never go down that road of lies and betrayal again. And I changed my way of looking at relationships and trust the healing process was long and arduous, marked by many arguments and tears, but also by moments of forgiveness and rebuilding. At every step I learned more about myself and about the true meaning of love and loyalty. It was a journey of self-acceptance and forgiveness, not only for me, but for all involved. As time went by, the wounds began to heal, and the pain to subside. Our family emerged stronger and more united than ever. Transformed by the storm we faced together, the experience taught us valuable lessons about the importance of open communication, mutual respect, and honesty in relationships today. I look back with gratitude for all the personal growth that experience has provided me. Although it was a difficult journey, it was also an opportunity to become a better and more compassionate person. And as we move forward, we keep the memory of what happened in our hearts as a constant reminder of the power of love, forgiveness, and redemption.